Howdy do there, squirrels. The washing machine is washing. So you might hear some crazy noises in a little bit. It's old. It'd be like me, it'd be old. Oh no, where did my... Oh, come on now. My bookmark went away. Hang on. Oh, there it is. Okie dokie, here we go. Sometimes no tragedy happened. The same woman was 3 or 4 months in a situation and there was no trace of illness. Nothing. Remember Tommy was talking to Dr. what's his name? Murray. No trace of illness. Nothing. Then she left to go to another job, and in that next job, within 3 weeks, 2 of the family died after eating bacon for breakfast. The fact that all these things happened in different parts of England and at irregular intervals made it some time before the police got on her track. She used a different name, of course, each time, but there are so many pleasant, capable, middle-aged women who can cook, it was hard to find out which particular woman it was. Why did she do it? I don't think anybody has ever really known. There have been several different theories, especially, of course, by psychologists. She was a somewhat religious woman, and it seems possible that some form of religious insanity made her feel that she had a divine command to rid the world of certain people. But it does not seem that she herself had borne them any personal animus. Then there was the French woman, Jean Gebron, who was called the Angel of Mercy. She was so upset when her neighbors had ill children, she hurried to nurse those children, sat devotedly at their bedside. There again, it was some time before people discovered that the children she nursed never recovered. Instead, they all died. And why? It is true that when she was young, her own child died. She appeared to be prostrated with grief. Perhaps that was the cause of her career of crime. If her child died, so should the children of other women. Or it may be, as some thought, that her own child was also one of the victims. "You're giving me chills down my spine," said Tommy. "I'm taking the most melodramatic examples," said the doctor. "It may be something much simpler than that. You remember in the case of Armstrong, anyone who had in any way offended him or insulted him, or indeed if he even thought anyone had insulted him, that person was quickly asked to tea and given arsenic sandwiches, a sort of intensified touchiness. His first crimes were obviously mere crimes for personal advantage, inheriting of money, the removal of a wife so that he could marry another woman. Then there was Nurse Warrener, who kept a home for elderly people. They made over what means they had to her and were guaranteed a comfortable old age until death came. But death did not delay very long. There, too, it was morphia that was administered, a very kindly woman, but with no scruples. She regarded herself, I believe, as a benefactor. You've no idea, if your surmise about these deaths is true, who it could be? No, there seems no pointer of any kind, taking the view that the killer is probably insane. Insanity is a very difficult thing to recognize in some of its manifestations. Is it somebody, shall we say, who dislikes elderly people? Who had been injured or has had her life ruined, or so she thinks, by somebody elderly? Or is it possible someone has her own ideas of mercy killing and thinks that everyone over 60 years of age should be kindly exterminated? It could be, of course. It could be anyone, of course, a patient or a member of the staff, a nurse or a domestic worker. I have discussed this at great length with Millicent Packard, who runs the place. She's a highly competent woman, shrewd, businesslike, with keen supervision both of the guests there and of her own staff. She insists that she has no suspicion and no clue whatever, and I'm sure that's perfectly true. But why come to me? What can I do? Your aunt, Miss Fanshawe, was a resident there for some years. She was a woman of very considerable mental capacity, though she often pretended otherwise. She had unconventional ways of amusing herself by putting on an appearance of senility. Senile? Senile. Being senile. But she was actually very much all there. What I want you to try and do, Mr. Beersford, is to think hard. You and your wife, too. Is there anything you can remember that Miss Fanshawe ever said or hinted that might give us a clue? Something she had seen or noticed, something that someone had told her, something she herself had thought peculiar. Old ladies see and notice a lot, and a really shrewd one like Miss Fanshawe would know a surprising amount of what went on in a place like Sunny Ridge. These old ladies are not busy, you see. They have all the time in the world to look around them and make deductions and even jump to conclusions. That may seem fantastic, but are sometimes surprisingly entirely correct. Tommy shook his head. I know what you mean, but I can't remember anything of that kind. Your wife's away from home, I gather. You don't think she might remember something that hadn't struck you? I'll ask her, but I doubt it. He hesitated, then made up his mind. Look here. There was something that worried my wife about one of the old ladies, a Mrs. Lancaster. Mrs. Lancaster? Yes. My wife's got it into her head that Mrs. Lancaster has been taken away by some so-called relations very suddenly. As a matter of fact, Mrs. Lancaster gave a picture to my aunt as a present, and my wife felt that she ought to offer to return the picture to Mrs. Lancaster, so she tried to get in touch with her to know if Mrs. Lancaster would like the picture returned to her. Well, that was very thoughtful of Mrs. Beersford, I'm sure. Only, she found it very hard to get in touch with her. She got the address of the hotel where they were supposed to be staying, Mrs. Lancaster and her relations, but nobody of that name had been staying there or had booked rooms there. Oh, that was rather odd. Yes, Tuppence thought it was rather odd, too. They left no other forwarding address at Sunny Ridge. In fact, we've made several attempts to get in touch with Mrs. Lancaster or with Mrs. Johnson, I think the name was, but I have been quite unable to get in touch with them. There was a solicitor who I believe paid all the bills and made all the arrangements with Miss Packard, and we got into communication with him, but he could only give me the address of a bank. Banks, said Tommy dryly, don't give you any information. Not if they've been told not to by their clients, I agree. My wife wrote to Miss Lancaster care of the bank and also to Mrs. Johnson, but she's never had any reply. That seems a little unusual. Still, people don't always answer letters. They may have gone abroad. Quite so. It didn't worry me, but it has worried my wife. She seems convinced that something has happened to Mrs. Lancaster. In fact, during the time... Oh, shoot. Lost my spot again. May have gone abroad. Didn't worry me, but worried my wife. She seemed convinced that something has happened to Mrs. Lancaster. In fact, during the time I was away from home, she said she was going to investigate further. I don't know what exactly she meant to do, perhaps see the hotel personally, or the bank, or try the solicitor. Anyway, she was going to try and get a little more information. Dr. Murray looked at him politely, but with a trace of patient boredom in his manner. What did she think exactly? She thinks that Mrs. Lancaster is in danger of some kind, even that something may have happened to her. The doctor raised his eyebrows. Oh, really? I should hardly think. This may seem quite idiotic to you, said Tommy, but you see, my wife rang up saying she wouldn't be back yesterday. She would be back yesterday evening, and she didn't arrive. She said definitely that she was coming back. Yes, she knew I was coming home, you see, from this conference business. So she rang up to let our man Albert know that she'd be back to dinner. And that seems to you an unlikely thing for her to do, said Murray. He was now looking at Tommy with some interest. With my foot. Yes, said Tommy, it's very unlike Tuppence. If she'd been delayed or changed her plans, she would have rung up again or sent a telegram. And you're worried about her? Yes, I am, said Tommy. Have you consulted the police? No, said Tommy. What'd the police think? It's not as though I had any reason to believe that she was in trouble or danger or anything of that kind. I mean, if she'd had an accident or was in a hospital, anything like that, somebody would communicate with me soon enough, wouldn't they? I should say so, yes, if she had some means of identification on her. She'd have her driving license on her, probably letters and various other things. Dr. Murray frowned. Tommy went on in a rush. And now you come along and bring up all this business of Sunny Ridge. People who've died when they oughtn't to have died. Supposing this old bean got onto something, saw something, or suspected something and began chattering about it. She'd have to be silenced in some way. So she was whisked out of it quickly and taken off to some place or other where she wouldn't be traced. I can't help feeling that the whole thing ties up somehow. It's certainly odd. What do you propose to do next? I'm going to do a bit of searching myself. Try these solicitors first. They may be quite all right, but I'd like to have a look at them and draw my own conclusions. And that's all of chapter 11. And let's see. I'll see what I can read of a little bit of 12. Tommy meets an old friend. From the opposite side of the road, Tommy surveyed the premises of Messon. I guess it's Messon. It shouldn't be Messon. I don't know. Messrs. Partingdale, Harris, Locker Ridge, and Partingdale. They looked eminently respectable and old-fashioned. The brass plate was well worn but nicely polished. He crossed the street and passed through the swing doors to be greeted by the muted note of typewriters at full speed. Hang on, I'm going to see what this is. It just says, used as a title to refer formally to one or more than one man simultaneously or in names of companies. It's like Mr. Like plural for Mr. Okay. Typewriters at full speed. He addressed himself to an open mahogany window on his right which bore the legend Inquiries. Inside was a small room where 3 women were typing and 2 male clerks were bending over desks copying documents. There was a faint, musty atmosphere with decidedly legal flavor. A woman of 35 odd, with a severe air, faded blonde hair, and a pince-nez rose from her typewriter and came to the window. "Can I help you?" "I'd like to see Mr. Eccles." The woman's air of severity redoubled. "Have you an appointment?" I don't remember that name being one of them. It's not. Eccles, okay. The woman's air of severity redoubled. "Have you an appointment?" "I'm afraid not. I'm just passing through London today." "I'm afraid Mr. Eccles was rather busy this morning. Perhaps another member of the firm?" "It was Mr. Eccles I particularly wanted to see. I've already had some correspondence with him." "Oh, I see. Perhaps you'll give me your name?" Tommy gave his name, address, and the blonde woman retired to confer with the telephone on her desk. After a murmured conversation, she returned. "The clerk will show you into the waiting room. Mr. Eccles will be able to see you in about 10 minutes' time." Tommy was ushered into a waiting room, which had a bookcase of rather ancient and ponderous-looking law tomes, Tomes, and a round table covered with various financial papers. Tommy sat there and went over in his own mind his planned methods of approach. Doggone. Lost my spot again. Planned methods of approach. He wondered what Mr. Eccles would be like when he was shown in at last, and Mr. Eccles rose from a desk to receive him. He decided for no particular reason that he could name to himself that he did not like Mr. Eccles. He also wondered why he did not like Mr. Eccles. There seemed no valid reason for dislike. Mr. Eccles was a man of between 40 and 50, with grayish hair thinning a little at the temples. He had a long, rather sad-looking face with a particularly wooden expression, shrewd eyes, and quite a pleasant smile, which from time to time, rather unexpected, broke up the natural melancholy of his countenance. "Mr. Beresford?" "Yes. It's really rather a trifling matter, but my wife has been worried about it. She wrote to you, I believe, or possibly she may have rung you up to know if you could give her the address of a Mrs. Lancaster." "Mrs. Lancaster," said Mr. Eccles, retaining a perfect poker face. It was not even a question. He just left the name hanging in the air. A cautious man, thought Tommy, but then it's second nature for lawyers to be cautious. In fact, hang on. Be cautious. In fact, if they were one's own lawyers, one would prefer them to be cautious. He went on. "Until lately, living at a place called Sunny Ridge, an establishment, and a very good one, for elderly ladies. In fact, an aunt of my own was there and was extremely happy and comfortable." "Oh, yes, of course. I remember now, Mrs. Lancaster. She is, I think, no longer living there." "That is right, is it not?" Yes," said Tommy. "At the moment, I do not exactly recall." He stretched out a hand towards the telephone. "I will just refresh my memory. I can tell you quite simply," said Tommy. "My wife wanted Mrs. Lancaster's address because she happens to be in possession of a piece of property which originally belonged to Mrs. Lancaster. A picture, in fact. It was given by Mrs. Lancaster as a present to my aunt, Miss Fanshawe. My aunt died recently, and her few possessions have come into our keeping. This included the picture which was given her by Mrs. Lancaster. My wife likes it very much, but she feels rather guilty about it. She thinks that it may be a picture Mrs. Lancaster values, and in that case she feels she ought to offer to return it to Mrs. Lancaster. "I see," said Mr. Eccles. "It's very conscientious of your wife, I'm sure." "One never knows," said Tommy, smiling pleasantly, "what elderly people may feel about their possessions. She may have been glad She may have been glad for my aunt to have it, since my aunt admired it, but as my aunt died very soon after having received this gift, it seems perhaps a little unfair that it should pass into the possession of strangers. There's no particular title on the picture. It represents a house somewhere in the country. For all I know, it may be some family house associated with Mrs. Lancaster." Quite," said Mr. Eccles, "but I don't think." There was a knock, and the door opened. A clerk entered and produced a sheet of paper, which he placed before Mr. Eccles. Mr. Eccles looked down. Yes, I remember now. I believe Mrs." He glanced down at Tommy's card lying on his desk. Beresford rang up and had a few words with me. I advised her to get in touch with Southern Counties Bank, Hammersmith branch. This is the only address I myself know. Letters addressed to the bank's address, care of Mrs. Richard Johnson, would be forwarded. Mrs. Johnson, I believe, a niece or distant cousin of Mrs. Lancaster's, and it was Mrs. Johnson who made all the arrangements with me for Mrs. Lancaster's reception at Sunny Ridge. She asked me to make full inquiries about the establishment, since she had only heard about it casually from a friend. We did so, I assure you, most carefully. It was said to be an excellent establishment, and I believe Mrs. Johnson's relative, Mrs. Lancaster, spent several years there quite happily. She left there, though, rather suddenly," Tommy suggested. Yes, I believe she did. Mrs. Johnson, it seems, returned rather unexpectedly recently from East Africa. So many people have done so. She and her husband had, I believe, resided in Kenya for many years. And I'm going to stop right there. Not too much, but better than nothing. Y'all have a great day. See you in the YT streets. Be sweet, don't be ugly. Love ya. Bye.